Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Paul Lewis. I'm the Policy Director here at the Eno Center for Transportation. Welcome to our webinar today entitled Safer Railroading, a discussion about targeted safety policy. And this is inspired by our report that we released 2 weeks ago with a very similar title, where we explore the next phase of safety policy for railroads. We looked at railroads being one of the most safe modes of transportation, and talk about how the different players involved can affect change in addressing the next areas of safety where we need to target our efforts. And so I'm going to walk through this agenda here. So we've got 3 parts on the webinar today. The first 2 are going to hopefully go rather quickly. I'm going to review the Safer Railroading paper and some of our key findings. I'll talk through our policy recommendations. And then for the best part, we've invited several folks from the industry who will join me after the presentation for a discussion about how we can take the recommendations that we came up with in our paper and apply them in the real world, and talk about some of the opportunities and challenges in doing that. Let me start here by talking through our paper, what it is, and what it found. And so Safer Railroading is for free download on Eno's website. I encourage everyone to take a look at that. And then as I'm going through this paper, and as we're going through the discussion with a panel here in a few minutes, if you have a question for me or for a panelist, please put that in the questions box on your GoToWebinar questions chat area. And so you'll see a spot where you can put in questions, type that in. I'll see those questions and we'll get to as many as we can. All right, so when we talk about the research goals of this paper, we want to understand where railroad safety has been a success, where safety is still a problem, and this is partially inspired by the completion of positive train control, which is a safety technology that basically eliminates the chance of some of the most horrific types of train crashes, mandated by the federal government. It's been a big push of federal policy for the past decade. Now that that's over, what's next for safety policy, and how can we be a productive part of that? So the report is a review and has a review of the current railroad safety policy structure, the different entities involved, including the railroads and different levels of government, private, nonprofit sector, labor unions, all the different players that help make railroads safe. We review safety data that's collected by the Federal Railroad Administration. I'm going to talk a little bit about that here in a minute. And we review existing literature, case studies, and examples of successful policies. And then finally, we have some key findings and recommendations. And so when we looked at the top line safety numbers, this is the evidence of success, right? If we look since 1991, we have seen a 60% decrease in safety incidents on all railroads. That is a tremendous success, something that has taken a concerted effort of all of the different players that I talked about earlier, and has real implications for the safety culture that exists on railroads today. That kind of bottomed out at about 2008, 2009, and has plateaued since then at about 12,000 incidents per year. And I'll talk about the differences of these, right? Because some of these incidents are minor slips and falls that the workforce encounters, to some of the more dramatic train crashes and everything in between. So we wanted to kind of pull away the layers and figure out what this actually means. And then the other success, of course, is that railroads compared to other freight modes are also quite safe, right? And only the waterborne transportation is safer. And if we look at the fatalities per billion ton miles, waterborne is a little bit about, six times or so, 5 times or so safer than railroads. But railroads are 4 times safer than trucking. And if you take away, if we're counting fatalities, if you take away things that are somewhat outside of railroads' control, like highway grade crossings and trespassing incidents, railroads actually end up being much safer than any mode of transportation. And so, kind of depending on how you look at it, railroads are an incredibly safe mode of transportation. But of course, there's still work to be done, right? And this was a big impetus from this work. While we did see a pretty dramatic decline in fatalities, right? The first graph I showed a few slides ago was looking at overall incidents. Fatalities are down too. If you look from the early 90s down to about 2012 when they bottomed out, a 45% reduction in fatalities, which is a huge success. But we've seen a reversal of that trend. And since 2012, things have been trending in the wrong direction. And so a lot of this research is trying to figure out why that is and what we can do about it. When we talk about safety incidents, the FRA and the industry generally groups them into 4 different categories. There are highway grade crossing incidents, right? This is where a car or a truck crosses a railroad at a specified area and there's a collision. There are train accidents that are not at grade crossings. This is everything from some kind of head-on train crash to a minor derailment, but something that's happening where a train is involved in an incident that is not at grade crossing. There's workforce and kind of other incidents that are related on the railroad. And then there are trespasser incidents that are not at grade crossing. So people that are illegally entering tracks and interacting with the train in a way that is inappropriate or dangerous. And so when we talk about those 4 areas, fatalities are really concentrated, right? Whereas the kind of that other category, which is workforce incidents, mostly trips, slips, and falls, is 55% of the total incidents. It's a very small percentage of the total deaths. And in fact, 97% of deaths are either at grade crossings or involve trespassers. And so a lot of this work really focuses on those 2 issues because that's the real safety concern when we're talking about serious injuries and loss of life. So slicing and dicing it a little bit, we wanted to look at the safety metrics by different types of railroad. And so we have here this table 2 from the report. There's a lot on here and I'm going to go over it rather quickly. But each type is listed across the top, each different category of railroad from the large class 1s to the smaller regional or short line railroads that are categorized in the group 2 or group 3 railroads. We also pull out Amtrak and commuter railroads to distinguish those as different types of railroad properties. And so the thing to note here is that the cells that are in red indicate higher than industry average, right? So this is, we're taking higher than that top row. And this is where we see the class 1 railroads tend to have the highest safety record if you look at total incidents, whereas the other groups of railroads tend to have higher than industry average incidents. But it varies, right? And this is where the highway grade crossings tend to be focused on the smallest railroads and involve Amtrak trains. If you look at train accidents that are not at grade crossings, right? This is either the collisions or which most of these are derailments. It's actually class 1s that tend to have the highest rate of train accidents not at grade crossings, whereas Amtrak and commuter rails are the safest in the industry. When it comes to trespassing and employee injuries, we see some of the smaller railroads and the passenger railroads also having much higher than industry average incident rates. And there's a lot of complexities within these that we're going to get into in our discussion with the panelists here in a few moments. But we thought this was really interesting how it's not the same across the board. And it's similarly not the same across geographies. And so the top 2 bullets here are talking about grade crossings. Grade crossing concerns are particularly high in Alabama, California, Florida, Illinois, Indiana, Louisiana, Ohio, Texas, kind of scattered all over the country. There's not really necessarily a rhyme or reason to these, especially if we're looking at all of these have high numbers and increasing trends. Low rates of grade crossing incidents and declining trends happen in the data in Arkansas and Kansas, Kentucky, New Jersey, and Oklahoma. So different states have a very wildly different incident rates. and not necessarily correlated to whether they have high rates of grade crossing crossing guards or active warning signals and arms and those kind of things. The data also looked at trespassing, and some states have high and troublesome trends and others do not. And here we look at Georgia, California, Colorado, Florida, and Oregon having some high rates and worrying trends. And meanwhile, Massachusetts, Michigan, Minnesota, and Washington, and I don't think it's related to the M's in their name, they have relatively low trespassing incidents and declining rates, and it's not always clear why. And so we did a lot of work to try to investigate and pull apart some of those pieces to get some answers there. And so I want to go into some of our key findings and policy recommendations here quickly before we start the panel. But the key findings, which I've alluded to this whole presentation, is that the trespassing and grade crossing incidents, they really need attention. Federal focus for a long time has been on the train accidents and on the workforce incidents that are not at grade crossing, with pretty good success, right? That's where we've seen the biggest decrease in incidents. That's where we've seen the fewest amount of deaths. And so that federal focus has overall worked. We need more emphasis on the trespassing and grade crossings. But we have to recognize that because this is not the same on every railroad, because they're not the same in every state, addressing it will require a tailored approach. And the literature very strongly says it has to be a combined approach. You can't just rely on better engineering or better education or better enforcement. It has to be all of those things working together. And then finally, we need more research to determine the outcomes of existing and new policies and treatments to help address these problems. And one of the frustrating things is that in some of the states that had very high rates of safety incidents and worsening trends, we were unable to find a specific program or a specific cause for that. And same in the states where we saw positive trends and low rates. There was no specific policy or action that we could really tie to having that big and positive result. And so some of this really needs to bring more data and quantify the outcomes of some of the initiatives that we're launching. And there's lots of safety initiatives ongoing. And there's not to say that there isn't a lot happening out there, and there's not a lot of new technologies and new approaches and new education campaigns. But we rarely take those campaigns and tie them to specific outcomes and then publish the results so that other policymakers across the country can learn from them. And so our recommendations, I think, follow very similarly to what our key findings are. The first is we have to expand funding to support rail trespass prevention. Right? Where there already is some federal funding for grade crossing removal and investments in better and enhanced grade crossing safety, there isn't the same level of support for trespass prevention. And we have to take these grade crossing and trespassing issues with that targeted, right? Meaning finding those hot spots, those hot states, those railroads where there's specific issues, and use education, enforcement, and engineering in concert to address it. And then also we have to involve areas outside of transportation. A lot of the trespassing incidents relate to things like addiction and despair and poverty and homelessness and suicide, right? That are well beyond the transportation's profession alone to address. And so this is kind of incumbent on the industry to form partnerships with other parts of public policy to make sure that we're addressing this holistically. We need to target funding to geography and railroads with persistent problems, and then quantify the outcomes of those specific initiatives so we know what we're talking about. And then finally, it would be helpful, particularly given trespassing is the largest issue in terms of fatalities and injuries, we need to share more data. And this also can include hotspots, near misses, other components of the data that would be helpful in targeting that funding to the areas where it's going to make the biggest benefit. So those are our recommendations that we have here. And I think that these are well supported in the paper, and I'm curious to get into the conversation here. But the next step, of course, is taking these from a research document and putting them into practice. And so that's where we have a panel discussion to help talk about this. And so I'm going to invite the panelists here in a moment to turn on the cameras, but we have Brenda Moscoco, who is the Assistant Vice President of Safety Policy and Analysis at the Association of American Railroads. We have Steve Predmore, who is the Executive Vice President and Chief Safety Officer at Amtrak. And we have Chuck Baker, who is the President of the American Short Line and Regional Railroad Association, joining us today for this discussion. So I would invite those three panelists to turn on their cameras, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can all see each other. Hello, everyone. Again, thank you all for the panelists for joining us. I'm really excited to have you for this discussion. We've got about 45 minutes or so for us to talk through this. And again, for the folks on the live webinar, if you have a question, please go ahead and put that into the question function on your GoToWebinar screen. I see that we already have a couple coming in, which is great. I'll be getting to those here in a few minutes. But I want to start with a broader question, and we'll hear from Brenda and then Steve and then Chuck in that order. Really kind of just a general reaction, right, to the paper, but bringing it more to your own experience, right? Safety incidents have declined pretty dramatically in the past 30 years, which is a huge success. But there are some types of incidents that are trending in the wrong direction. If you could just kind of give a little bit of an introduction to your role and your organization's role in the broader industry. Describe a little bit about what your particular part of the industry has done over the past 30 years and successfully. And then also talk about where you are seeing problems growing. So again, let's start with Brenda and get the perspective from the Association of American Railroads.
Thank you, Paul. Our 7 Class 1 railroads account for the majority of freight activity and railroad employees in the U.S. In 2020, the Class 1s operated about 76% of total train miles, which translates to about 438 million miles over a network of about 92,000 miles of road. And on average, the length of haul for Class 1s is about 1,000 miles. So the past 30 years have been a safety success story for us. And we're particularly proud of the strides we've made in employee safety, with the employee injury rate reaching an all-time low in 2020. And this is after several years of having also reached all-time lows. This means that our training programs, our daily job briefings, and the safety initiatives, including peer-to-peer feedback programs, are really paying off. The Class 1s have a state-of-the-art training facilities that allow for hands-on training and simulators for locomotives, for welding, signal systems, and more. These enable the employees to practice real-life skills in a safe, rigorous, and controlled environment. Then the training is reinforced by daily job briefings to ensure everyone is on the same page and following the safety rules. Now, these programs and protocols have made the rail industry one of America's safest places to work. Our employee injury rates are better than comparable sectors such as trucking, farming, manufacturing, and construction, even grocery stores. Now, the train accident rate has also dropped dramatically. Part of the success is due to the robust interchange rules and freight safety standards that the rail industry maintains, and they often go above and beyond government standards. And in fact, DOT has been known to ultimately incorporate some of these into their own rules. Now, another reason for the success is the significant investments that we make. Over $25 billion a year is what railroads invest, the Class 1s, to maintain and modernize the infrastructure, including the equipment, the track, and the structures. And this has allowed the railroads to leverage technology in many ways, from automated track inspections that can detect issues the human eye cannot and cover more territory than we could using traditional methods, to wayside technology that can perform equipment inspections. And they could do this while the trains are rolling by at track speed, and they could detect a variety of developing defects before they actually can cause accidents. So this also includes, as you mentioned, the incorporation of positive train technology. And finally, while most grade crossing and trespass incidents arise from factors outside of the railroad industry's control, And together, these are the single most persistent safety challenge we have. We are committed to reaching the goal of 0 deaths. We have worked diligently to improve grade crossing safety. Of course, the safest crossing is one that is closed, and the rail industry has worked in earnest with communities to close as many of those as possible. We've also worked to increase the number of crossings that are equipped with gates. So together, these two improvements have made a significant impact on safety. Additionally, at grade crossings, we've incorporated microprocessor technology that can be used to monitor the health of the active crossing devices to make sure that the gates and the lights are working as intended. And some of our active crossings are able to provide highway users with constant warning time, which will ensure that trains traveling at lower speeds have the same amount of warning time for the highway users. And in terms of trespass prevention efforts, those take many fronts, from planting rose bushes to prevent incursion onto the right-of-way, to along hotspots, to training our rail workers on how to identify someone who may be contemplating suicide and properly intervene. So the safety improvements over the past 3 decades are really the results of the industry's holistic approach to safety, and they will continue to be impactful, I think, in reaching the ultimate goal of 0 accidents.
That's great. Thank you, Brenda. And now let's go over to Steve for his perspective from Amtrak, which operates not only passenger trains, but passenger trains on some of their own right-of-way, and then also on some of host railroad right-of-way, which adds some complexity. So Steve, again, I'd like to hear a little bit about Amtrak's role in this, and where you've seen success and where you see some of the persistent challenges.
Yeah, thank you, Paul, and thanks for the opportunity to participate on this panel. So we're really excited at Amtrak to be celebrating our 50th year of providing safe rail service as America's national passenger rail service. We operate serving more than 500 destinations across 46 states, the District of Columbia, and Canada. And we operate on 21,400 miles of routes. It's the nation's only high-speed intercity passenger rail provider. We operate at speeds up to 150 miles an hour. Next year, that'll go up to 165 with the entry into service of the new Acellas. Nearly half of all of our trains operate at top speeds of 100 miles an hour or greater. And our max speed off the corridor is limited to 79 miles an hour. We own and operate 750 miles of tracks. 20,685 miles of the track that we operate on is owned and maintained by host railroads, to your point. So we own and maintain 3% of the tracks that we operate on. We employ a workforce of approximately 18,000 employees nationwide, with about 15,000 of those employed under collective bargaining agreements. And we also maintain an Amtrak police force of 430 uniformed officers. When included among U.S. airlines, Amtrak ranks 7th in domestic passengers carried. We carried more than 3 times as many riders between Washington, D.C. and New York as all airlines combined, and Amtrak carried more riders between New York City and Boston than all airlines combined. When we look at the history of safety, in this industry, Amtrak's been very proud to be a leader in a number of safety initiatives over the years. This is a really exciting time to be a part of Amtrak, and I joined about 2 years ago. To be part of Amtrak and this industry, I think this is a real critical inflection point for our industry. As we move from safety strategies largely born on accidents, very reactive, addressing concerns rising out of individual accidents, to being a much more proactive, safety managed industry. PTC is the best, most recent example, I think, of what we as an industry can do and have been able to accomplish. We're very pleased and proud that we were able to fully implement PTC across our system by the December 31st deadline this year. And a very complex undertaking for us, operating under 3 different PTC systems. But in the last 4 years at Amtrak, we have focused intensively on implementing a structured safety management system. We were pleased to be the first Class 1 railroad to receive approval from the FRA for our System Safety Program Plan, which is the framework around which our SMS operates. Our SMS adopts a systematic, data-driven approach to risk identification and mitigation to drive continuous safety and security performance improvement. And we have an SMS for our security efforts as well. These efforts are sustained through safety culture change that's grounded in the principles of just culture, that's the fair and consistent treatment of our employees, and building an organization that learns from our experiences, a learning organization. Those experiences are both good and bad. So we're now working intensively with our partners, host railroads, tenant railroads, state agencies, to look at how our SSPP and our SMS interfaces with their safety programs as well, so we can raise the level of safety for the industry as a whole. Since we began our SMS 4 years ago, we've experienced consistent year-over-year improvement in almost all of the safety metrics that we track. But much as your charts showed earlier, Paul, recently we've seen a plateau in safety performance improvement, and that indicates to us that we need to do something different to continue to drive down the kinds of incidents and accidents that none of us want to see. So that's our commitment. We're looking closely at that, and we look forward to working with all of our partners, those in the panel and everyone else, to raise the level of safety across the industry.
Very good. All right, on to you, Chuck.
Thanks, Paul. Really appreciate being on this panel. I've worked on and off with Eno for a long time. I think not to suck up too much to our host here, but I do think it's a world-class organization. You know, for folks listening, I'll say I didn't get to write any of the report. Eno jealously guards its independence, but I think it acknowledges at the beginning of the report that the three of us and a few others got to be on the advisory panel, so we at least got a chance for input and you know, to add in thoughts, and so I really appreciate that opportunity too. I'm going to assume most people listening sort of know generally what short lines are, so I'll just do like the 20-second short story. There are 607 roughly freight railroads in the United States. Brenda's group represents primarily the big seven, and those are the ones that most people have heard of, you know, Norfolk Southern, Union Pacific, folks like that. The fact that there's another 600 smaller ones, not a lot of people know that. We tend to be sort of the branch lines, more rural lines, and more kind of out of the way areas. A lot of them used to be branch lines of Class 1 railroads that over time became short lines. They're not all like that. Some short lines are switching railroads in big cities or serve ports, but if you think of the typical short line, it's kind of in a more out of the way area, less freight traffic, fewer customers, slower trains, tracks not in typically as great of a shape. So, you know, that's kind of what a short line is. But nonetheless, over the last 30 or 40 years, our safety record sort of imitates the Class 1s and Amtrak in that it's been really a huge improvement over the decades. And it's we are not at zero incidents in the types of incidents we can totally control, you know, great like derailments and employee accidents, but we're frankly getting pretty close. We are really proud of it. It's a ton of work. Short lines that, you know, largely fund the work out of their own cash flow, out of their own operating revenues, and so they have to be sort of economically viable to do that kind of work. But we also do get some grants from the federal government and local and state governments in the short line world. Our Class 1 friends don't really get those types of grants or generally ask for them, but short lines are happy to ask for them, and we generally need the help. And so whether it's the 45G tax credit, CRISI grants, or just, you know, the short line's own money over decades of engineering and better trains and better safety culture, you know, derailments and employee accidents have dropped really, really close to zero. Again, not zero, so we're not satisfied, but it's been a huge success story. But as this report, I think, really points out and really comes at a key time, grade crossing and trespassing is a totally different story. It is a huge source of frustration, just to be totally honest, within the industry. Those numbers have plateaued for years. We feel like there's a lot of effort made, both within our railroads and at our associations and at the federal level and at the state level, and with partner organizations to bring attention to it and to warn people about it and to, you know, try to lower those incidents. And it just hasn't, you know, it frankly hasn't worked that well. I mean, there's probably lots of incidents don't happen that otherwise would. So maybe it's worked some, but those numbers have just been stubborn and they haven't dropped. So I do think your report constantly goes back appropriately to sort of what we call the 3 E's, but education, engineering, and enforcement. And we don't have any big magic bullets other than sort of doubling and tripling down on those 3 E's. And we get into some details over that. But it's something Short Lines would be very interested in partnering with everyone we can find on how to lower those. And I'll just put in a plug briefly here at the top, and I will come back to this group over and over again. An Operation Lifesaver, I think we're going to come back to sort of over and over again as perhaps what we think is out there as sort of the best bang for the buck on more investment and more focus and more support of Operation Lifesaver. We think could play a huge role, and they're a group that's had, we think, sort of outsized success with a very small budget and very small kind of staff. And so I think there's probably some room for improvement there. And we'll get into this too, but our VP of Safety, Joe Strang, who has also helped on the advisory panel, sort of informally, I guess, for this, is also the board chair of Operation Lifesaver. So we try to we're strong supporters of that group, and I think there's a lot there.
That's great. Thanks for that, Chuck. And I think the paper obviously agrees with a lot of your comments, and we've appreciated the help from you and others on the panel and around the industry, and helping develop our thinking on this. And part of this is also just people recognizing that there is an issue going on, and it needs kind of a concerted effort, right? And railroad safety is in the news right now because of the Amtrak crash in Montana. We don't know what happened and why, but it does kind of point to kind of the different priorities. It's that kind of incident is very rare, and NTSB immediately dispatched a team, right? It's this kind of all hands on deck to figure out what happened and then take correction to make sure it doesn't happen again. But right now we're looking at 16 people every week that are dying from trespassing incidents or grade crossing, right? And so those numbers don't make the headlines. And so and have real impacts, not only just on the railroads, but on broader society and everything that goes with that. So how do we bring more priority to these type of incidents, and kind of elevate this issue to a national priority? And I will direct this one to you, Brenda, to start. Kind of given your role at AAR, I mean, how do we take the attention and put it where it's really needed?
Well, as Chuck pointed out, we really do need to partner with others. Operation Lifesaver, of course, when it comes to education, but also, there are other organizations out there. There is GRASP, the Global Rail Alliance for Suicide Prevention, and we at FRA, at AAR, sorry, former FRA. We have worked together with OLI. We've got the C-Tracks Think Trains campaign, and we've also supported, along with FRA, the other works and of course Amtrak and the short lines, the other work that OLI does. Every year we have Rail Safety Week. That's a great opportunity to spread the word. We get a lot of media coverage for that. That's important. And there's also what we call ILCAD, the International Level Crossing Awareness Day. And next year we're hosting, along with others, out in Denver, Colorado. And so we expect to have at that grade crossing event actually a session that'll address both suicides and trespass. So we're starting to get more and more involved with these types of events where people can come out, share their best practices, share lessons learned, go over case studies, and begin to do some of what you're talking about, which is, kind of evaluating things and see what will work for my community. Because as you pointed out, sometimes it's the local circumstances that'll determine what will work better than something else that someone else has tried somewhere else. So I think that there's some of that. I do have to also applaud some of what's going on over at NHTSA and at DOT with FRA. You know, they've got a good campaign that they started a few years ago, you know, with the media ads and that sort of thing. And there's, you know, also in recognition that this is, when it comes to grade crossings, a lot of this is really, you know, highway related too, because the exposure comes from the highways and the trains. So we've got NHTSA, which has made it a really high priority to crack down and eliminate impairment due to drugs, due to alcohol, and of course due to distraction. And I mean, you see people stopped at red lights all the time, and what are they doing? They're staring down at their cell phone. So, you know, I think we can leverage and partner with others, and that'll really get us to where we need to be.
That's great. And I have a couple questions about OLI, but I want to talk and pick up on the partnership aspect that you just discussed, Brenda, and direct that to Steve, right? Where Amtrak kind of has to operate on a partnership basis. You know, as you mentioned, most of your train miles or at least track miles are on other railroads. So what are some of the lessons from that partnership effort, and how can we leverage some of the successes that Amtrak has had in the past and apply that to the big challenges ahead of us?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I mean, we, as I said, in 97% of the track we operate on, we don't own or manage or, you know, have minimal control over enhancements, improvements. So we have to work in partnership with the host railroads. And I think, you know, we've been pleased with the reception that we've gotten and the opportunity to try to move mitigations forward. It's a difficult challenge because when you look at the numbers in the aggregate, they're stunning. And you think of the human tragedy as well as, you know, the other costs associated with this, you say, well, we just need to address this. But it's distributed across a very, very complex system. So any one railroad, any one community, any one state, you know, just sees a little bit of the problem. And so I think what's needed is what are, you know, the questions I would have as I look at what we have done is there's a lot of activity that's going on, but where is the coordination around that? Where is the national strategy, you know, to address this and identify what are the priority areas of risk reduction we need to tackle? What works? What do we know works? What do we have questions still about? And what new technologies or innovations, you know, can we apply to the problem? But I think what's needed more than anything is that really concerted approach that all the stakeholders have to be part of in elevating the importance of the issue, and then really driving to resolution, measuring that effectiveness. So the effectiveness of those mitigations. So what I see isn't so much a lack of funding. Maybe there is. I mean, I'm not going to turn away money. But how does funding line up with, again, what those priority areas of improvement are, and you know, how do we drive to implementation available technologies and look at new technologies that maybe can help us.
Very good. Chuck, you brought up Operation Lifesaver a couple times, and that's something we heard pretty consistently when we were talking to experts in the field as part of this research, is that generally people feel very positively about Operation Lifesaver and some of its initiatives and its accomplishments, but that is somewhat flying in the face of what we're seeing as a reversal of some of the trends, particularly in trespassing and grade crossing incidents, where fatalities have increased fairly dramatically over the past decade. And so what are some of the things that a group like Operation Lifesaver could be doing, or is it do we need a new approach, or do we need to do more and have more resources to do more of what's working, and what are some of those things that are working?
Yeah, I think from our perspective, you know, Operation Lifesaver is pretty impressive and gets a pretty good bang for the buck, but compared to frankly, I guess compared to the scope and the total numbers of the problem, it's really quite tiny. And so, you know, my takeaway is that it's doing well, but we need a much more robust investment in it. And I don't have any, you know, self-interest in that. Like, I don't, you know, short lines don't get a cut of Operation Lifesaver or anything like that. But I would think both at the federal level, at the railroad support level, and at the state and local levels, you know, if I were the czar of fixing grade crossing and trespassing, that would be the first place I'd put my investment. I think it's largely in the education side of the 3 E's. I think there's for sure opportunities on the engineering side, both on railroad engineering and on road engineering, and on the enforcement side, and I'm sure we'll get into that. I think there can be some good targeted activities with law enforcement, which doesn't have to be railroad law enforcement, can be actual, like the regular police departments enforcing, writing tickets for people who inappropriately cross and access railroad property illegally. But I think OLI is largely on the education side, and I just think there's a lot more opportunity there. For instance, kind of a good, neat thing they did recently was they partnered with a group called Safe Kids Worldwide, and through Safe Kids Worldwide, they got to the Head Start program, and they put, some railroad trespassing and grade crossing awareness in front of that kind of the global Head Start program, and just got that information out there to that community. But like Steve said, it is a big, complex network. There are hundreds of thousands of grade crossings, and I would love to see OLI in every school, on every kids group, at Boy Scouts, at Girl Scouts, at homeless shelters, at encampments, and there, we see a lot of them because we spend a lot of time thinking about this. But for most of the world, probably 95% of the United States couldn't even tell you what OLI is. So I think there ought to be a huge double, triple, quadruple down on OLI, and I think that's kind of maybe the best opportunity out there.
That's great. Now, I love those specific examples of initiatives. Those are always, I think, really, really important to explore and investigate. So I'm going to turn to a couple questions coming from the audience, because we've getting a lot here about trespassing. That is the biggest concern. If you look at overall fatalities, it's also probably one of the toughest nuts to crack, not only in solutions, but also, and I think some of the people have been emailing me and are commenting here that the reporting on trespassing can be a little problematic, in part because FRA categorizes some of the fatalities that are suicides, or at least deemed to be suicides, a little bit differently, and so sometimes the numbers don't always mix up, and that can be challenging to understand where things are happening, why they're happening, and where the problems are. And so the report does try to address that, but it is the reporting of that is challenging. But from a policy standpoint, right, which is the real thing we're trying to get to, is how do we address the issue of trespassing, and whether it's suicide or otherwise, it's the biggest issue facing. What is a federal role in that issue, right? The federal government can't necessarily come up with a specific standard, right, where they can, like they can for track, right, or other, like, positive train control. There's no positive train control for trespassing incidents, right? That's a very different type of approach. So how does the federal government get involved in this? And again, we'll go back to you, Brenda, given your role at AAR. I just want to see if you have any thoughts about how we address trespassing from a federal perspective. Is it just more money, or is there some other specifics or standards that we could be making at the federal level to take this head on?
Well, I'd like to point out that FRA has begun to hold regional trespass prevention summits. The first one was, I think, held early in September down in Florida, and they'll be scheduling others. This will allow folks, at the community level to share in these experiences, best cases, begin the dialogues. It'll also allow greater participation, because when you have a nationwide, it's, in DC, people can't get here, but when you have them regionally, folks can begin to talk about the same issues that they see and things that are working. Also, I think we're seeing, I know this is not federal, but the Transportation Research Board, they've established a subcommittee on trespass prevention, trespass and suicide, and they're actually going to have a workshop next January as part of the annual TRB conference. And they're looking at research needs statements, and they're going to have various presenters. So That's a good opportunity too. But also, you know, when it comes to government and funding, we're very excited about the bipartisan infrastructure bill that's on the Hill now. And, you know, we're going to be able to see, I think, $843 million a year. And that's going to require partnership from all of us here and those in the audience to really put that money to work, to make sure it's a good down payment and that, you know, the riskiest crossings are addressed. So I think that there are good things out there. We just have to keep at it.
And then, so related to that, I'm going to ask a question back to you, Chuck, about you know, your members of the short line regional railroads. You have 600 of them scattered all over the country. Is trespassing come up in board meetings and discussion with those members? Does it come up in one region more than others? Is it an urban issue? Is it a rural issue? I mean, in your experience, at least anecdotally, I mean, where are you finding your members seeing that it's more acute of an issue?
That's a good question. I would say it sort of tracks your, you know, the sort of the nationwide data that you suggested in some of the slides you shared at the beginning. You tend to see it, I guess I'd group it into two buckets about what I at least hear about anecdotally. One is kind of the, you know, like sort of the despair / homeless / drug users / you know, like people who are not doing well, frankly, you know, mentally, economically, socially, culturally, and so you see a fair amount of that, and people express, you know, the railroads express frustration and sadness and a desire to do something about that, but with a population that's extremely hard to reach and to talk to. It's not like, you know, if you want to go speak to drug users and homeless, you know, people experiencing homelessness in your community, like, well, what are you're not going to do radio ads. You can't go give a presentation at a conference, right? So that's a frustration. And then I'll call the other bucket would be people in sort of a very high growth areas, and maybe some of these states, you know, like Georgia, Texas, Florida, that you pointed out, I think sort of fall more into that bucket of places that have had a lot of growth around, you know, railroads that have been there forever, but all of a sudden there's a lot of people who live around there. Maybe there's a new school, maybe there's a new housing development, maybe there's new stores or whatever around railroad tracks where there didn't used to be. And now there's people who are sort of new to that railroad environment. And they find that a little easier. Obviously, anytime there's an incident, it's just as tragic and horrible, but they at least find that easier to think about addressing, right? Because if there's a new condo development next to the railroad track, there's sort of an obvious target of, well, I can go put flyers there, or I could go ask the OLI representative in the area could go ask to speak to the, you know, a group of residents or that sort of thing. So I hear sort of those two buckets. It does come up. I mean, anytime there's an incident on a railroad, you know, it gets to the very top level. The ownership and the president and the CEO of the railroad are pretty upset about it, along with, you know, the train drivers, frankly.
And if I could just build a little bit on Chuck's comments, yeah, our experience as well is that these things tend to cluster, and you know, I think we have 2 routes that account for 31% of our trespasser strikes, and more than 30% of the trespasser strikes were suicide indicators were present in 21. So you know, there are hot spots, and we have a general sense of where they are, and they tend to be, you know, correlate very highly with these, you know, areas of sort of folks on the margin, homeless camps, and you know, folks on the fringe, high rates of substance abuse and addiction and so forth. So you know, I think as a problem, again, you know, there are opportunities to target and look for solutions, probably broader than what we as a railroad can do. It speaks to sort of the social change and the social initiatives we have to take on, but and support. but much more targeted, I think, than in our experience than the grade crossing accidents.
Got it. And so that's an interesting point. And I think one of the things that came up a lot in our research, and I'm going to ask this question to the broad panel, and so have some of you, one of you raise your hand, is that there are a lot of times the individual railroads in specific know where some of these hotspots are, right? I mean, there's nobody more in tune with their own railroad than the railroad. And so are there a couple specific examples of where a railroad said, I've got this hotspot that's been a problem for trespassing incidents, and they've reached out to local law enforcement, or they reached out to a local homeless shelter or a condo association or whatever, and made an action, and that resulted in a demonstrable change. And so one of the things that I think is important in this is just kind of calling out some of those specific examples. I want to see if any of you have one of those that you might want to share.
I don't know about a specific example. I can say that that's exactly what we do. And again, we're fortunate to have the Amtrak Police Department, who works very, very closely with law enforcement in these communities. When we know we have a hotspot, we have a high level of activity and folks on the rails, and that we reach out to APD, who will work with law enforcement to try to enforce laws preventing people from walking on our tracks or walking on our host tracks, because in most cases it's a host rail, but also then working with the host railroads as well, because if we're experiencing it, we know they are as well. And again, that's where I think sitting down with our sort of our joint data, our joint information about what our experience is, and then driving mitigation or resolution together, working together, is really, really critical. The other area that we're really focused on is where are hotspots that we don't know about. And so you mentioned in the paper the work the Rutgers University is doing, and we're working with them on that to try to identify proactively where those hotspots might be, so that we can look at what our options are around mitigation before we have a strike.
Got it. And Chuck, I want to. Go ahead, please.
Sure. Just very briefly, I would say I have a nice example of a railroad that I think sort of proactively tried to prevent a hotspot, but Louisville and Indiana Railroad, which is a short line owned by Anacostia, which runs between Louisville and Indiana. They recently raised speeds on a section of their track because they got some grant money and some of their own private investment, and they were able to upgrade the corridor. And so it's through a relatively populated area, and they were very concerned that they were going to end up with a hotspot because they've been running trains at 20 miles per hour for decades, and now all of a sudden it was going to be 40 or 50 miles per hour. And so they launched a pretty targeted kind of local awareness effort, and I think had a lot of success on that. And I guess it strikes me as, this one was more proactive than reactive, but it strikes me as if you have something specific to say, whether it's responding to a death or responding to a new housing development or responding to a change in operations or whatever, you can maybe break through the sort of wall of noise out there, right? Everyone's inundated with information already. So if you have something specific to say, maybe that can help break through. And I think they took a good advantage of that in that circumstance to get people's attention with, hey, big trains are going to be coming through faster than you're used to.
That's perfect. And that kind of plays into one of the findings. Is one of the causes that the literature found in terms of grade crossing incidents was the difference between train speeds and how the track signals are timed to grade crossings, right? So if a track signal is timed for a 50-mile-an-hour train, and trains normally come through actually at 20 or 30 miles an hour, it's a long time to wait. Drivers get frustrated, they go around the gates, and then when a train does come through at 50 miles an hour, those people that are used to a slower train can run into a problem. And so that was one of the issues that was identified, and one potential solution is technology, right? And are there better ways of developing fail-safe grade crossing control devices that that can be more responsive to train speeds? Or is there more technology? We found some technology that could help identify trespassers using infrared cameras and artificial intelligence, right? There are some of these new technologies coming online, unclear as to whether they can be deployed in real life and what they mean for effectiveness of actually cutting some of the incidents. But I wonder what the role of technology is. And maybe Brenda, we'll start with you. A lot of class ones have been investing in new crossing devices. What new technologies are we seeing? What's working?
Well, sure, yeah, the class ones spend hundreds of millions of dollars to improve grade crossing safety every year. And I think what you are referring to is a constant warning time. It's important for the highway user to know how much time they're going to have between when the gates go down and when the train comes, because we can't control their actions. They are going to try and beat the train many times. And so constant warning time is not cheap. It's working with the track circuitry to be able to know, at what speeds the trains will come by. So that's expensive. But again, we circle back to, we're going to be receiving a nice pot of money, 843 million a year. That's more than we've had in the past to work with. So I think we are going to be able to see a difference there. We also have, like you mentioned, intrusion detection, that sort of thing. And I know there's some pilots out there that have worked with that. And it's, you have to be able to recognize the humans from say other objects or animals that might be triggering the devices. That's a challenge. So I think we're getting there. They just have to refine the technology a little more. That's just a couple of examples. And Chuck, you got me thinking with when you talked about the homeless, and I know there's been efforts on the West Coast to relocate the homeless encampments, but that's not necessarily always going to be a permanent solution, because sadly folks will probably be back, or the move, or you have to be very careful that you're not just simply relocating the issue.
Very good. I recognize we only have 2 or 3 minutes left before the top of the hour. I want to make sure that Steve and Chuck also have an opportunity to comment on new technologies or new approaches beyond what we've already talked about. So yeah, Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, no, just quick. I think this is so important. Look, education and information are absolutely vital. We need to double down our efforts there, no doubt about it. But as I look at where our challenges is as a railroad across all areas of safety, I see too many cases where our safety depends on people being flawless and doing exactly what we want them to do, exactly when we want them to do it. And that's just not the human condition. And so, we need to introduce new technologies that make, your encounter at a grade crossing more predictable, understand what's going to happen and how long you have and all of that. But we cannot rely on people to do the right thing day in and day out, because they just won't, intentionally or unintentionally. We know that's not the human condition. So we've just continuously got to look at ways of introducing new technologies and engineering solutions that supplement or, the human behavior.
That's a really good point. Yeah, when in our research we have a chart that the FRA does have for some of the train crash incidents. They have different causes, and human factors are one of the top of those. So that jives very well with what we found. Chuck?
Yeah, one of the things I believe it's covered in the report, but we haven't talked about yet is. I believe going back to the FAST Act, there was a requirement for the top 10 states with the worst grade crossing safety records to implement grade crossing action plans. And I think that holds some promise. And I'd say even within that, one of the strategies that we think would make sense would be to focus kind of on top 10 counties or top 10 areas, to really sort of break through. Again, we find this problem of like, either we're trying to talk to people we have no ability to reach, or we're trying to talk to people who are just inundated with walls of noises and warnings and information, and it's hard to break through. So, one of the ways that we found we think makes sense is if you can tell somebody, hey, your county is the most dangerous county or the worst county in the worst state in the country for grade crossing accidents, right? And that's maybe a way to catch people's attention. It's no fun to talk about bad news all the time, but you need to sort of break through the wall of inattention and point out that people can die, right? You stand in front of a train or you drive in front of a train and you're going to die, to be blunt about it. And it doesn't, again, going back to the thing I said at the very beginning, it hasn't totally seemed to penetrate, and it's been a little frustrating. And so we will continue to double down on that and partner with anyone we can partner with. And I'll maybe end with the same place. We really think OLI holds a ton of promise. I'd encourage any short lines that are listening to get involved with OLI at their state levels. There's state chapters for OLI. And then I don't lobby for OLI, I lobby for short lines, but I will do a little pro bono lobbying to any kind of federal policymakers here that are listening. There's a lot more room for federal support for OLI. And boy, that's a pretty good bang for the buck out there.
Very good. Well, as you mentioned, it's no fun to talk about tough issues, but this is clearly one that warrants a ton of attention. I really appreciate the panelists and all their help in not only developing the research, but talking frankly today with us about solutions forward. Right, this is what we hope to be as a start of a longer conversation about this, and perhaps a new paradigm in our national approach towards some of these safety issues, so that we can make a real dent in addressing some of these lingering problems. So I want to thank the panelists very much for joining us today. There will be a recording of this available on the website, as well as a copy of the slide deck. If anyone has any further questions, I know we didn't get to all the questions, but I will be following up with some folks, or you can email me directly here at Eno, plewis@enotrans.org. Would be happy to continue the discussion, and we certainly will with this group. So again, thanks everybody, and thanks for tuning in.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, guys.